Hello everybody, I'm Felix Wemheuer, Professor for Modern China Studies at the University of Cologne, and this is my YouTube channel studying Mao's China. In the first video I gave an introduction to market socialism cycles of reforms. This was the intellectual global history of market reforms under state socialism and also its impact on China. Here in the second video I will more go into detail and look at the relation of China and Eastern Europe in the early 1980s in this context. And this question I like to raise and to answer is, why did the exchange with Eastern Europe matter for the Chinese reform agenda in the early 1980s? And the second question is, how did reform and opening that started after 78 in China differ from Eastern European market socialism? And I mainly mean the two models of reforms, Hungary and Yugoslavia. The first part is about the impact of diplomatic relations. Here you can see a state visit of Erich Honecker, the party head of Eastern Germany, in China in 68. So when reform and opening began in 78, the relations to the Soviet Union was very tense. The China-Soviet split occurred in the early 1960s. China invaded Vietnam in 1979 after the Vietnamese army had marched into Cambodia to overthrow the Khmer Rouge, and also the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, which is heavily criticized by China. So by that point of time, here you can see this relation, a cartoon, the Chinese dragon Huagofeng and the Russian bear. The research on reform and opening also have shown that Huagofeng played a very important role in early reforms, and it was later Deng Xiaoping who created a narrative where he got all credits for reform, and Huagofeng was linked then to conservatism and Maoism. In reality, it was much more complicated. For example, you can read the work of Frederick Tevis and Warren Sun. So China wanted to improve relations with countries in Eastern Europe, but the relations to the Soviet Union was very bad. So they started with countries who were already quite independent from the Soviet Union. So one was Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was a model for market socialism in the 1960s and 70s. China had heavily criticized the reforms under Tito in the polemic with the Soviet Union, and had argued that this would be a form of restoration of capitalism, revisionism, and even had called Yugoslavia a fascist state. Now, step by step, they revised the verdict and labeled Yugoslavia as a socialist state. So this provided then opening space to learn from the reforms in Yugoslavia. So Tito was invited in 1977 to visit China, and Huagofeng made one of his first state visits abroad in Yugoslavia. If you're more interested in this, Susanne Weiglin-Schwörzek and Lo Hong published a piece about that will I put in the notes that you can find below the video. So another country that was more independent from the Soviet Union was Romania, that had retreated from the Warsaw Pact and had heavily criticized the Soviet invasion in Prague in 1968. So Huagofeng also made a state visit in Romania. Romania was no model, of course, for market socialism. This was more or less a traditional Stalinist model where many resources were directed into infrastructure and heavy industry. And Huagofeng, in the beginning, he had the idea of a so-called foreign leap, that he would import Western and Japanese technology to push China's industrialization. So for the followers of this idea, Romania was also an interesting point of reference. It took longer to normalize a relation with the Eastern European countries from the Soviet bloc on a state and on a party level. So it was only after Gorbachev came into power in 85 that then he later allowed the Eastern European countries to go their own way, and this also provided opportunity for them to renormalize relations to China. Here you can see a picture of Zhao Ziyang, the head of the Chinese party, visited Eastern Europe. Here in East Germany, he also went to Yugoslavia and to Poland, to Hungary and to Bulgaria, who all were closely allied with the Soviet Union. And in the early reforms, also economists from Eastern Europe played an important role. They were invited to China, but also as points of reference in the debate. Isabella Weber also wrote about it in her book How China Escaped Shock Therapy, and also Gurwitz and Unlikely Partners. For example, the Polish economist Bruce was invited, and also the Czechoslovakian economist Otar Schick. Both were Eastern European economists in exile and were linked to market socialism, especially Schick, who already had wrote a book about Plan and Market in 1965 and was the architect of the economic agenda of Prague Spring. But also Janusz Kornai was invited to China, who was very critical about the centralized planned economy. He still was in Hungary, but also had affiliation to Western universities. And their works were translated into Chinese. Here you can see an internal journal material of economic research, published a speech of Otar Schick that he gave in China, and here is also the translation of Janusz Kornai's Shortage Economy, his famous book. And it's quite interesting. In the early 1980s, this kind of books were not only discussed within a small cycle of economists, but also in the media, and a broader audience was interested to understand the problems of centralized planned economy. The Chinese government, and especially the Academia of Social Science, then sent delegations to Eastern Europe, and this of course was a lower level than state relation, and was possible already before full diplomatic relation had been normalized, for example in the case of Hungary. So one of the first delegations went to Yugoslavia, headed by Sung Ye-pang, who was one of the most famous Chinese reform economists, who already called for reforms in the mid-1950s. I introduced him in the first video. And then delegation to Hungary, headed by the famous economist Yu Guangyan, and to Romania and Hungary. And economists played an important role, because in the beginning the Chinese government really did not know how they should reform the system, and was willing to listen to advice and also listen to many opinions and proposals. This was quite of an open time. So I just will focus on the case of Hungary. So why would the Chinese leadership and the economists study Hungary? Yeah, this was a small country. China is a very large country. However, there were some similarities, because in Hungary the legitimacy of the Communist Party was heavily damaged in 1956 due to the violent crackdown of the uprising. And to overcome this legitimacy crisis, the government then in the later years would focus on economic development and the improve of living standards to regain trust and legitimacy in the population, the so-called goulash communism. And Hungary had very ambitious reforms in 1966 to dismantle the so-called command economy and allow that some market mechanism were introduced into the system of state ownership. And Hungary had no ambitions for political reforms. This also was one reason why the Soviet Union allowed Hungary to continue the economic reforms, because they guaranteed they would not go into the direction like the Prague Spring. And the Chinese leadership, Deng Xiaoping and Chen Yun, they were quite open and expressed that now China should study all kind of experiences, but it was still clear that they disliked the Yugoslavian model, because workers' self-management, they were not willing to provide so much autonomy to workers and enterprises. So the Hungarian model fitted more what they wanted to do, economic reforms, but no radical political reforms. And just to give you an example, this also was published in this internal journal, Materials of Economic Research from the Academy of Social Science, who went to Hungary in 1983. They wrote then a long report, and as you can see, they visited many governments, departments, scientific institutions, cities, and also enterprises. As I said, these reports were written in a quite neutral tone. The Chinese were not naive to believe there is a model like the Soviet Union in the 1950s. We just have to copy these models. They would look for achievements and failures, and wanted to provide comprehensive information to the leadership. So just to give you some examples for that. So they came to a judgment that the Hungarian reforms had a quite of mixed results, and there were different periods in the development. So from 66 to 72, this was considered by the Chinese authors of this report as the era of economic growth and rise of living standards and golden area. However, after the oil crisis of 73, the reforms stagnated, and also the Hungarian economy and the Hungarian government started a kind of new cycle of reforms then in 79. But this already was under the pressure of financial crisis, of a budget deficit, and massive foreign debt that Hungary had already at that time, and that huge imbalances within the economy. And one important point of these reforms was to legalize the second economy, meaning the black market. And in Hungary, by that point of time, there was already quite a huge also black labor market. And if I has also said before, there are similarities to Lenin's new economic policies, because some people argued that this was a legalization of black markets that already had existed under the non-functioning distribution system of war communism. The Chinese were especially interested in also the reasons for failure, and one was somehow an external shock. So Hungary is highly dependent on the world market, has just a few raw materials, so where they were hit by the oil crisis, where prices skyrocketed on the world market. But the Chinese economists, they also came to the conclusion that the government had allowed that wages had risen beyond economic growth. This also can be found in the reports to Poland, that they said, okay, there's so many welfare benefits, but that really they do not fit the economic level of development of that country. And as Isabella Weber and others has shown, key of the economic reforms in the industries in the beginning were price price reforms. China introduced also a dual track system by the mid-1980s, means that some prices then they were set free and were determined by markets, while other prices still were set by state administration. And already here in this report, they also look how the Hungarians implemented a dual price system. For example, the Hungarian government believes that prices for wheat and meat are extremely important and politically sensitive, so there should be fixed prices, because often price reforms would result in higher prices for daily goods, right? And when then wages have to be increased, and then you would have a problem of inflation. And for example, corn was not considered that important and politically sensitive, so the Hungarian government allowed what they called guided prices. This means that between two parties prices were fixed and then written into contracts. And for vegetables, they were afraid that there would be too few incentive to raise vegetables for peasants, because they were quite low. So the state set a minimum price for vegetables as a guarantee. So what impact had the reforms in Hungary or in Yugoslavia on China? So I think what's important is that the Chinese economists could borrow concepts that would help them to rename and change their system by introducing market mechanism, but without calling it a market in the beginning. As I had said in the first video, China only labeled its economy as market socialism in 1992. By the mid-1980s, also China, the Chinese leadership then allowed to use the concept of socialist commodity economy, 社会主义的商品经济. And of course this frame had been used in Yugoslavia and in Hungary, in other Eastern European countries before. So references to Eastern Europe were helpful as long as learning from Western capitalism was taboo. Also, Hua Guofeng also visited West Germany and France, and Deng Xiaoping went to Japan. But when it came to the Western states, the argument was more they have more advanced technology or management system. We can learn from that. But by that point of time in the early 1980s, the economists could not argue that they want to learn from their capitalist economic system. But in the case of Hungary and Yugoslavia, they could argue, right, they are also socialist countries. They introduced market reforms, and we can study their achievements and also their failures. And the Chinese economists and leaders, they were not naive. The delegations who went there also saw problems, or also the local cadres were aware of these problems. For example, that Hungary and Yugoslavia had a problem with massive inflation and also a welfare burden for the state. And as I have argued in this video earlier, China could rebuild diplomatic relations with Eastern Europe before the full normalization of Sino-Soviet relation. And maybe one lesson was that the social welfare should not be expanded too fast. So the leadership around Deng Xiaoping developed a three-step model how China should become a mid-level industrial developed country by the mid of the 21st century. So the first step was that there should be enough production that everybody can eat full and would not have to freeze. This was like a first step for the 1980s. Then the next step was Xiaokang, a kind of a moderate level of welfare, and then the last step would be like the full modernization until the mid of the 21st century. So it's very different from the Eastern European governments in the early 1980s, like Poland or Hungary, who permanently were sometimes increasing welfare transfers or subsidies because they were afraid of workers' unrest, and especially in Poland. However, there were also some limits to learn from Eastern Europe. So did the Chinese economists or political leaders really believe that these models were so good, or that socialist commodity economy is a good concept, or did they only use it because they could not make neoliberal arguments at that time and was safe? A Bauhaus sun, as the Chinese said, a protective umbrella. By the mid-1980s, the economic crisis in Hungary and Yugoslavia was quite obvious. Even leaders from these countries in private conversation warned Chinese, we have so many problems, don't copy us. And Peter Vámos, an Hungarian scholar, also have shown that in the early 1980s there was a huge interest on both sides, also in technology, in Hungarian technology on the Chinese side, and in interest to improve this relation. However, when both countries had more direct access to Western markets in the 1990s, this interest then declined or almost disappeared for a while. And what were motives of Eastern European actors? This is still a good question for research. In this presentation, I only have focused on the Chinese actors in this relation. So the next part will be market socialism, Eastern Europe and China compared. So what was quite similar, for example, to Hungary. So that the price reform was introduced with a dual track system of prices that were fixed by the state and others were determined by the market. However, I have no direct evidence that the Chinese side copied the Hungarian model. Also, what was very similar, that already in the reforms of 66, Hungary decentralized. Its system gave more autonomy to enterprises in order to let enterprises compete against each other, and also more power to the management. The same was done in China. Also, Deng Xiaoping then pushed that in the constitution the right to strike was not included again. However, in both countries in the 1980s, no privatization of state-owned enterprises took place. It only was argued that there was more competition needed between the enterprises. But there's also some China's characteristic, so I do not argue that there is no Chinese characteristic at all. I think this system is unique to China. They decollectivized agriculture, but without the privatization of land. So in the 1960s, this was called Baochanda-Hu, where they assigned the quota that had to be fulfilled in the plan to the rural families, who were the major units of production. Then this system was eliminated step by step, that the peasants could then decide what to grow and what would sell. However, the state still remained in collective ownership in the countryside and state ownership in the cities, and later it was called family responsibility system. What's very important for the success story of economic growth in the 1980s were the collective township enterprises. They could hire rural workers and had no obligations to give them benefits like in the state-owned industries. This was a kind of a precarious labor force, as if we would say. Today there is a debate between Joel Andreas and Huang Yasheng whether or not this should be considered a kind of a socialist element. Huang Yasheng is arguing that as many of these enterprises had the label of collectively owned, but were de facto run by private businessmen. In China that was called wearing the red hat, Dai Hong Maozi, and they could hire the collective state township enterprises many laborers as they want, while private enterprises were limited to 8 workers until I think it was 888. China also then opened up as a kind of a cheap labor market for foreign capital. The leadership believes that the countryside had a huge overpopulation, also due to the household registration system that had prevented a rural urban migration in the Mao era. So there were millions of people in the countryside who could leave the village and work outside agriculture. They could, for example, then move to the special economic zones and work in the sweatshops and enterprises which foreign capital investment. And in the 1980s, the huge private sector developed. Barry Norton wrote this quite famous book, Growing Out of the Plan. And I think it was easier in China because the peasantry was never included in a socialist welfare state in China, in contrast to the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. And many peasants were quite willing to work in factories because it was an improve of their income. So market socialists in, for example, in Hungary, they were also in favor to develop a small private sector, but not that large as in China in the 1980s. And there were other factors, of course, that played a role while reform and opening in China became a success, at least in economic terms. So the Chinese leadership identified the country as a developing country. They were quite modest. They said, we are backward, we are poor, we want to learn from countries that are more experienced. This was very different from the attitude of, for example, Gorbachev and the Soviet Union, who considered themselves as an industrial world power and were much less willing to learn. And what's important is this geopolitical shift, right, with the Sino-US alliance after the Nixon visit. The US was willing to lift economic sanctions against China, and a huge technology transfer took place, while the technology sanctions against the Soviet bloc was kept until the Soviet Union collapsed. But in the 1970s and 1980s, the US government, also the Republican ones, discovered China as an ally against the Soviet Union. Some scholars say a big advantage of China was the existence of Hong Kong. Also during the Mao era, a lot of foreign trade was done through Hong Kong, but this was done by that time, then in the 1980s, an important global financial capital and a good place to link with the world market. And the leadership then around Deng Xiaoping also mobilized a lot of resources that the Chinese should reconnect with families from overseas and ask their uncle in Singapore to invest in China. And many overseas Chinese now were also willing to invest. This was also good for the Chinese leadership, so they could say, no, we are not selling out to Western foreign capitalists, but our Chinese friends abroad will invest. And in the early 1980s, the most important investments came from the surrounding Greater China. And this was kind of a good timing to opening up, because in the late 1970s, early 1980s, the four tiger states in Asia were quite booming, yeah, and this of course also then would help to promote development and growth in China. So I think in the 1980s the Chinese government launched their reforms quite within the scale of what we have called market socialism. Yeah, for example, introducing the dual track system, no privatization of state-owned enterprises, and so on. However, I would argue that after 92, China went far beyond this market socialism. Important turning point, of course, is the journey of Deng Xiaoping to the southern special economic zones, and then after Deng sends the message we must continue to open up, then new reforms are imposed, yeah, and also meanwhile the Soviet Union has collapsed. Also China had copied this model in the 1950s and were quite influenced it. So this, of course, created a kind of a critical, or helped the critical thinking, and that China should go somehow beyond the Soviet model. So very radical reforms then were imposed under Jiang Zemin and the Premier Zhu Rongji, where parts of the state-owned industries were shut down. There was a massive layoff by around 50 or 40 million many people. Many became unemployed, especially in the Rust Belt, old industrial zones of Manchuria. Of course, China kept some parts of the state-owned enterprises, but they were transformed into stock companies. So later they were very different from state-owned enterprises we know from the classic socialist system. Labor was commodified in this process, but also housing, right? In the early 1990s, there was little private ownership of housing in Chinese cities, and there was a full-scale privatization. Healthcare were heavily privatized. Also, many public hospitals then had to generate a profit. Security. I lived in China in the early 2000s. There were many public securities in the communities, but little policemen, and also education, a huge private market for extra lessons, but also for private schools and university around time. And Deng had also said that some will get rich first, some people, some regions, other might get rich later. So the Chinese leadership in the 1990s and early 2000s, they were willing to accept that there is a huge difference in economic income between social classes, but also between regions. So the market socialists in Eastern Europe, also in China in the 1960s or early 1980s, they had argued for more competition. But then in China they had millionaires and the billionaires that they went far beyond what a traditional market socialist of the 1960s would consider as a healthy difference or competition. Yeah, and I hope you liked my introduction to this topic. I also will post some recommendations for further reading below the video. So bye bye and see you next time.